People rarely notice when control slips away from them in conversation. There is no alarm, no clear signal. It happens quietly, beneath awareness, while attention is focused on words instead of structure. Most believe they lose control when they are interrupted, contradicted, or dismissed. In reality, control is usually lost much earlier. It is lost the moment the urge to speak becomes automatic. The impulse to respond immediately feels natural, almost virtuous. Silence is framed as weakness, hesitation, or lack of confidence. From childhood, people are conditioned to fill gaps, to answer quickly, to prove understanding, to show engagement. Over time, this conditioning becomes reflexive. A pause feels like a mistake that must be corrected, and because it feels wrong, it is avoided at all costs. This is not accidental. The fear of silence is rooted deep in social survival. In early human groups, being ignored was dangerous. Being unheard meant being irrelevant. Irrelevance meant exclusion. So the nervous system learned to associate silence with risk. Speech became a signal of belonging, a way to remain visible, a way to stay inside the group. But modern conversation is no longer about survival. It is about positioning. And instincts built for survival often sabotage positioning. What once kept someone safe now keeps them exposed. When people speak too much, they are not expressing confidence. They are regulating discomfort. Their words are not strategic moves. They are emotional discharges. The body senses uncertainty, and speech becomes a release valve. Each sentence lowers internal pressure, but also lowers external leverage. Because every unnecessary word gives something away. Conversation is not a neutral exchange of ideas. It is a system of subtle dominance, constantly recalibrating. Tone matters more than content. Timing matters more than logic. What is not said often matters more than what is. Yet most participants fixate on arguments, explanations, narratives. They try to win through clarity, through volume, through persistence. And in doing so, they expose themselves completely. The person who speaks the most reveals the most. Not just facts, but emotional states, needs, priorities, insecurities. Speech carries traces of urgency, of defensiveness, of desire. The faster and longer someone speaks, the more information leaks through. Even when the words are controlled, the rhythm is not. Silence interrupts this leakage. It contains information instead of releasing it. It forces the other person to move first. And movement, in conversation, is effort. Effort always reveals intention. This is where discomfort begins. When one person stops filling the space, the other becomes aware of it. The pause stretches, not long enough to be dramatic, just long enough to be noticed. And in that space, the mind begins working against itself. Questions arise. Was that too much? Was that unclear? Was that rejected? The silence becomes a mirror, and most people do not like what they see reflected. To escape that discomfort, they speak again. They add context. They soften statements. They clarify. They explain motivations that were never questioned. And every addition is a small concession. Not because the content is weak, but because the act of adding signals uncertainty. Those who understand this dynamic do not rush to correct misinterpretations. They allow them to exist. Because misinterpretation creates pressure, and pressure forces movement. The person under pressure begins adjusting. They shift tone. They seek alignment. They try to regain balance. Meanwhile, the quiet observer remains unchanged. This asymmetry is not aggressive. It is simply uneven. One side is working, the other is not. And in any system, the side that works less conserves energy and gains advantage. People often mistake talking less for disengagement, but disengagement withdraws attention completely. Strategic silence does the opposite. It concentrates attention. It creates focus. When someone speaks briefly and then stops, the listener leans in mentally. The statement feels heavier because it is isolated. There is no noise around it to dilute its impact. This is why short statements linger longer than long explanations. Not because they are smarter, but because they are incomplete. The human mind hates unfinished patterns. It wants closure. And when closure is not provided, it is sought internally. That internal effort binds attention far more effectively than any external persuasion. Those who talk too much believe they are guiding understanding. In reality, they are preventing the other person from doing the mental work that creates commitment. Commitment does not come from being told. It comes from figuring something out independently. Silence creates that space. Excess speech destroys it. There is another layer to this dynamic that most overlook. Emotional regulation. In any interaction, the calmer nervous system sets the tone, not intentionally, automatically. Calm signals safety. Safety allows patience. Patience allows observation, and observation allows control. When someone reacts quickly, emotionally or verbally, they signal that the interaction matters to them, that the outcome has weight, that something is at stake. This signal is subtle, but it is read instantly. And once it is read, the other party knows where leverage exists. Those who speak less rarely signal urgency. Their pace is slower. Their responses are measured, sometimes delayed. This delay is not accidental. It suggests that the conversation does not dictate their internal state. That suggestion alone shifts the balance. People tend to defer to whoever appears least affected, not consciously, instinctively, because composure under uncertainty reads as strength, and strength invites accommodation. Silence also disrupts scripts. Most conversations follow predictable patterns: statement, response, counter, agreement, or escalation. When one party refuses to follow the rhythm, the pattern collapses. The other person is forced to improvise. Improvisation increases error. Errors expose motive. This is why silence is difficult to counter. It offers nothing concrete to attack. There is no claim to refute, no emotion to escalate against, no position to dismantle. There is only absence. And absence requires interpretation. Interpretation always reflects the interpreter more than the source. As this pattern repeats, something subtle happens. The person who speaks less begins to feel heavier in the interaction, not louder, heavier. Their presence occupies more space without expanding outward. Others begin to adjust their behavior preemptively. They choose words more carefully. They hesitate before interrupting. They monitor reactions more closely. This adjustment is not requested. It is induced. Over time, people begin to project authority onto the quiet individual. They assume intention behind brevity. They assume selectivity. They assume restraint. Even if none of these were consciously chosen, the effect is the same. Perception reshapes reality. The critical distinction here is between silence as avoidance and silence as choice. Avoidance is tense. It feels brittle. It leaks discomfort through posture, micro-movements, forced stillness. Chosen silence is relaxed. It has no urgency. It does not need to resolve anything. And that difference is felt immediately. Those who master conversation without speaking much are not empty. They are full. Full enough not to spill unnecessarily. Their restraint is not suppression, it is containment, and containment creates form. As this awareness develops, a shift occurs internally. The urge to respond weakens, not because of discipline, but because the cost becomes visible. Speaking too soon feels like waste. Explaining feels premature. Correcting feels unnecessary. Silence becomes efficient. The conversation slows, the emotional charge dissipates. What remains is structure: who moves, who waits, who adjusts, who holds. And without any announcement, control begins to consolidate around the one who does not need to speak. As conversations continue to unfold under this dynamic, a subtle reordering begins. It is not announced, no one names it, but it is felt. The person who speaks less starts to become the reference point, not because they demand it, but because the interaction begins to orbit around their reactions, or more precisely, around the absence of them. Most people are accustomed to constant feedback, nods, verbal affirmations, small signals that say you're on track. When these signals disappear, the nervous system reacts. Attention sharpens, self-monitoring increases. People begin listening to themselves while they speak, adjusting mid-sentence, recalibrating in real time. This self-surveillance drains confidence. It fragments flow, and it shifts the psychological burden inward. In this state, people reveal far more than they intend. They explain motivations that were never questioned. They defend positions that were never attacked. They soften edges that were never challenged. Each of these adjustments is a response to imagined pressure, and imagined pressure is still pressure. It produces the same behavioral effects. The quiet participant does not need to manufacture this pressure. It arises naturally from asymmetry. When one person remains still while the other moves, the mover becomes aware of their movement. That awareness changes behavior. It creates hesitation, and hesitation is the first crack in perceived certainty. This is why attempts to dominate conversations through volume rarely work long-term. Loudness provokes resistance. Silence provokes introspection. Resistance hardens positions. Introspection weakens them. Control favors weakening, not confrontation. As silence becomes a consistent feature, the other person begins filling it strategically rather than impulsively. At least, they try to. They slow down. They choose words more carefully. They attempt to sound measured. But this effort is itself revealing, because effort indicates investment, and investment indicates vulnerability. The quiet individual does not mirror this effort. They do not match intensity. They do not rush to equalize the exchange. This refusal to synchronize creates a hierarchy, not an explicit one, but an experiential one. One person is adapting, the other is not. Adaptation is often framed as intelligence, as flexibility, and in many contexts it is. But in conversation, excessive adaptation signals that the environment is setting terms. The adaptable one is responding to conditions rather than defining them. Defining conditions does not require commands, it requires consistency. When someone consistently does not react, consistently does not over-explain, consistently does not rush, others begin to adjust expectations. They learn the pace, they learn the limits, they learn that pressure will not move this person. At this point, silence stops being interpreted as uncertainty and starts being interpreted as selectivity. Words are assumed to be withheld intentionally. This assumption alters perception dramatically. Every short response now feels deliberate. Every pause feels calculated. Even neutrality acquires weight. When speech appears after silence, it lands differently. It interrupts internal processes. It resets direction. A single sentence can redirect an entire line of thought because it arrives into a vacuum, and then silence returns, allowing the redirection to settle. This pattern conditions others. They learn that speaking too much gains nothing. They learn that pauses will not be rescued. They learn that over-explaining is unnecessary. Over time, the overall volume of the interaction decreases. The conversation becomes tighter, more deliberate. In such an environment, emotional reactions begin to feel inefficient. Outbursts feel out of place. Rambling feels excessive. Even humor changes tone. Everything compresses. The quiet individual does not need to enforce this compression. Their presence enforces it. By remaining steady, they set the ceiling. Others adjust to fit beneath it. There is also a temporal advantage here. Speaking less means thinking more. Not abstract thinking, but situational awareness. Tracking shifts, noticing micro changes, timing interventions. The quiet participant operates with better information simply because they are not busy transmitting. Transmission consumes bandwidth, reception requires none. And in any system, the one receiving more data than they send has an advantage. As this advantage compounds, something else becomes apparent. Control no longer feels active. There is no sense of effort, no strategic calculation. The interaction flows around stillness rather than being pushed by force. This is where many misunderstand the nature of power. They imagine power as exertion, as pressure applied outward. In reality, sustained power is non-reactive. It does not chase outcomes. It allows outcomes to come into view before selecting. At this point in the conversation, the quiet individual does not need to win anything. The structure already favors them. They can choose to speak or not, to engage or disengage, and that optionality is the clearest signal of control. Others feel this optionality even if they cannot name it. They sense that the conversation matters more to them than to the other. That asymmetry is decisive. From here on, the dynamic deepens. The conversation stops being about content and becomes about positioning entirely, and silence remains the central mechanism through which that positioning is maintained. As the dynamic settles, something less visible but more decisive begins to operate. The conversation no longer unfolds on the surface. It starts happening underneath. Words are still exchanged, but the real movement is in timing, restraint, and interpretation. The quiet individual is no longer just withholding speech. They are shaping the environment in which speech occurs. At this stage, others begin testing boundaries, not overtly, subtly. They introduce stronger opinions, slight provocations, emotional inflections meant to pull a response. These are not conscious challenges. They are instinctive attempts to restore symmetry, to see if the stillness will crack. When the stillness holds, something shifts. The provocations lose momentum. Without resistance, they fall flat. Without engagement, they cannot escalate. The absence of reaction becomes information in itself. It communicates that emotional leverage is ineffective here. This is where many fail if they attempt to imitate silence without internal alignment. Because silence without emotional neutrality feels tense. It invites probing. It signals suppression rather than control. But silence that emerges from internal stillness feels closed, not guarded, complete. Complete states do not invite intrusion. They do not leave gaps to exploit. There is nothing to push against. And so pressure dissipates. Over time, people begin to self-censor around such presence. They edit themselves before speaking. They avoid extremes. They temper emotional language. Not because they are told to, but because the environment no longer rewards excess. This is not respect in the sentimental sense. It is calibration. People calibrate to whatever feels stable, and stability in social systems becomes the reference point. At this depth, conversation becomes less about exchange and more about observation. The quiet individual notices patterns emerging. Who speaks when uncertain? Who accelerates when uncomfortable? Who fills silence with humor? Who fills it with justification? These patterns are consistent. They repeat across contexts, and once seen, they cannot be unseen. Most people are predictable not because they lack complexity, but because their nervous systems follow reliable scripts under pressure. Silence applies pressure without appearing to do so. It reveals scripts cleanly. There is also a shift in perceived authority. Authority stops being associated with expertise or assertiveness and starts being associated with composure. The person who appears least affected by the conversation seems most capable of steering it, even if they never do. This perception alters how others present information. They become more concise. They prioritize relevance. They avoid tangents. The conversation sharpens around what matters or what is assumed to matter to the quiet individual. This assumption itself is power. When others orient toward what they believe someone values, they are already subordinating their frame. They are guessing priorities instead of asserting their own. Silence creates this guessing, not confusion, focused uncertainty, the kind that narrows behavior rather than scattering it. At this point, the quiet individual can begin shaping direction with minimal input. A slight nod, a brief acknowledgement, a short comment placed at the right moment. These interventions feel disproportionate in effect because the environment is already primed. Priming is rarely visible. It happens gradually, through repeated patterns, through consistency, and by the time it is complete, it feels natural, as if the conversation was always meant to move this way. People often ask how influence can exist without persuasion. The answer is that persuasion targets beliefs. Influence targets conditions. Change the conditions, and beliefs reorganize themselves. Silence is a condition. It alters pace. It alters emotional temperature. It alters perceived stakes. It slows the system. Slower systems reveal structure. Faster systems hide it behind motion. Once structure is visible, control becomes trivial. There is no need to force outcomes. One can simply allow dynamics to resolve themselves. At this stage, emotional reactions from others become rarer but more intense when they appear. Because restraint builds pressure, and pressure seeks release. When release comes, it often overshoots. These moments are revealing, not to exploit but to understand. They show where identity is attached, where ego is sensitive, where fear sits. Silence does not create these reactions, it exposes them. The quiet individual does not respond emotionally to these releases, they let them pass. This non-response communicates that the emotional surge did not land, that it did not move anything. Over time, this teaches others something uncomfortable. Emotional display does not equal influence. Expressiveness does not equal control. Reaction does not equal relevance. This realization can be destabilizing, especially for those who rely on emotional energy to steer interactions. When that energy no longer works, they feel unseen. And feeling unseen forces a choice: adapt or withdraw. Adaptation usually takes the form of restraint. People become quieter, more deliberate, more measured. They begin to resemble the presence they are interacting with. Not consciously, by resonance. Resonance is stronger than imitation. It does not copy surface behavior. It aligns internal states. Calm invites calm. Stillness invites stillness. As this happens, the conversation enters a different register. Less noise, less urgency, more gaps, and in those gaps, meaning accumulates. The quiet individual does not need to fill these gaps. They let them exist. Because gaps slow time, and when time feels slower, perception deepens. Deep perception changes everything. It shifts focus from winning to understanding, from reacting to positioning, from speaking to sensing. This is where most people become uncomfortable, because sensing requires stillness, and stillness removes distractions. Without distractions, internal narratives surface, doubts, insecurities, unexamined motives. Silence forces confrontation with these narratives. That is why it is avoided. That is why it is powerful. The quiet individual has already passed through this confrontation, or at least they are not fleeing it. That alone sets them apart. At this depth, conversation is no longer something that happens between two people. It becomes a shared field. One person stabilizes it, the other navigates it. Navigation requires effort, stabilization does not. And the one who does not expend effort retains capacity. Capacity is the final currency, not intelligence, not charisma, not verbal skill. Capacity, the ability to remain unaffected, observant, and optional. From here, the conversation does not need to be controlled. It already is. At a certain point, the shift becomes irreversible, not because something dramatic happens, but because nothing does. The conversation no longer escalates. It no longer needs constant input. It settles into a low, controlled hum. And within that hum, hierarchy has already been decided. The quiet individual is no longer managing silence consciously. Silence has become the default state. Speech is the interruption, not the other way around. This inversion changes everything. Words are no longer used to fill space. They are used to alter trajectory. When speech is rare, it carries consequence. Not because it is profound, but because it is selective. Selection implies judgment. Judgment implies authority. Even when no judgment is expressed, the implication lingers. Others begin waiting, not overtly, subtly. They pause before speaking. They look for signals that never arrive. They delay decisions. This waiting is not obedience. It is orientation. The interaction has trained them where to look. This is where control often becomes invisible even to the one holding it. There is no sensation of dominance, no satisfaction, no thrill, only absence of friction. Conversations end sooner. Conflicts dissolve without resolution. Outcomes arrive without negotiation. The quiet individual does not appear victorious. They appear unaffected, and unaffected states are difficult to challenge. At this depth, the most important change is internal. Emotional reactions no longer rise as quickly. Provocation feels distant. Praise feels irrelevant. The nervous system has learned that expression is optional, that nothing requires immediate response. This does not create detachment from reality. It creates detachment from compulsion. The difference is subtle but decisive. Compulsion drives most conversation. The need to correct, to impress, to defend, to align, to be seen. When compulsion fades, what remains is choice. Choice is slow. Choice is quiet. Choice does not announce itself. The quiet individual now notices how much of human interaction is driven by discomfort avoidance. Words are used to smooth tension, to relieve anxiety, to escape uncertainty. Once this is seen clearly, it cannot be unseen. And once unseen, it loses power. Silence stops feeling like a tactic and starts feeling like a filter. It filters out urgency. It filters out noise. It filters out false stakes. What passes through is what actually matters. Most things do not pass through. This creates an economy of attention. Attention becomes scarce, and scarcity increases value. Not because it is withheld maliciously, but because it is no longer distributed indiscriminately. Those who receive attention notice the difference. They speak more carefully. They prepare more. They hesitate before wasting words. Not out of fear, but out of instinctive calibration. Calibration is the quiet mechanism through which social order emerges. No one declares it, no one enforces it. It simply stabilizes around what does not move. The quiet individual does not need to assert boundaries. Boundaries are implied by consistency. When someone never overextends, others stop expecting extension. Expectation shapes behavior more effectively than rules ever could. At this stage, attempts to regain control through verbosity or emotion feel crude. They stand out. They disrupt the calm, and disruptions are noticed immediately. The quiet individual does not punish these disruptions. They do not respond with correction. They let the contrast speak for itself. Contrast is persuasive without argument. Over time, people begin mirroring restraint not because they admire it, but because it feels appropriate. The environment has changed. Loudness feels excessive. Reaction feels inefficient. Silence feels normal. This normalization is the final consolidation of control. When restraint is no longer remarkable, it has won. The quiet individual can now speak freely if they choose. But they rarely do, because speaking freely would reintroduce noise, and noise no longer serves any function. The conversation has already delivered what it could. Any additional input would be decorative, and decoration is unnecessary. What remains is presence. Not performative presence, not attention-seeking presence, simply being there without needing to adjust the space. This presence carries weight because it does not ask anything of the interaction. It does not need agreement. It does not need validation. It does not need momentum. Needs are visible. Absence of need is not. Others feel this absence even if they cannot articulate it. It creates a subtle unease, not fear, not admiration, just awareness. Awareness that emotional leverage is ineffective here. Awareness that urgency is self-generated. Awareness that silence will not be rescued. This awareness changes behavior more reliably than instruction ever could. At the end of such conversations, people often feel drained without knowing why. They spoke more, they adjusted more, they revealed more, and nothing dramatic happened. No conflict, no resolution, just quiet imbalance. The quiet individual feels none of this. They conserved energy, they observed, they chose when to intervene, or they did not. Energy conservation is rarely associated with dominance, but it should be. Those who expend less to achieve the same or better outcomes are structurally advantaged. This advantage compounds across interactions. It is not about winning a single conversation, it is about shaping a reputation, a pattern, an expectation that follows into future exchanges. Over time, people approach differently. They simplify, they pre-filter, they avoid unnecessary emotion. They assume restraint on the other side and adjust accordingly. The quiet individual did not demand this adjustment. It emerged. This is how power actually operates, not through force, not through persuasion, but through gravity, through becoming the stable point others orient around. There is no triumph in this, no climax, no final declaration, only stillness. And in that stillness, something fundamental changes. Emotional reaction feels loud, excess speech feels wasteful, urgency feels artificial. What once felt natural now feels primitive. The urge to fill silence dissolves. The need to explain evaporates. The impulse to correct weakens. What remains is awareness, calm, detachment, not detachment from people, detachment from reaction, and once reaction no longer controls behavior, conversation no longer controls position. The quiet individual does not dominate the exchange. They simply stop being moved by it, and that is enough.